Genetics predicts that kids in a family are different from one another. I think the enjoyment from parenting comes from watching your kids become who they are, rather than trying to make them into what you want them to be, because that isn't going to work very well.
I'm here with Robert Plomin, not plumbing.
It's a made-up name, so it doesn't matter.
Who are you, Robert?
I'm a behavioral geneticist. That's someone who studies genetic influences on behavioral traits, which is mostly psychology, but it includes, some sociology and social sciences in general. But the main thing we do is to use genetic strategies to study individual differences in behavior, like why do we differ in mental health and illness and personality and cognitive abilities and disabilities. So we use both what we call quantitative genetics and molecular genetics. Quantitative genetics are like twin and adoption studies, which I think we'll get into. And then molecular genetics is the new revolution in DNA analysis, where you actually analyze DNA itself.
Okay, so why we differ from one human to another?
Yes, exactly right. It's a critical point that people don't quite understand. Like, people are often surprised to find, well, people will agree if you ask people, how heritable is height? You see people differ in height. What do you think that's due to? And people will say, yeah, that's mostly genetic. You're talking about why people differ.
And they're wrong?
No, they're right.
They're right.
And it turns out that the heritability, that is the extent to which genetics is important for height, is 90-some%. So that means 90% of the reason why we differ in height is due to inherited DNA differences. But here's where people make the mistake, is they think that doesn't refer to you as an individual. It doesn't mean I grew to be 90% of my height because of genes, and the other 10% is due to the environment. It refers to differences between people in the population. Why are some people taller than other people? It's a very important distinction, because a lot of misconceptions about genetics comes from not understanding that we're talking about individual differences in a population. So a trait could be highly heritable, but say your height.
I'm not sure if I understood the distinction that you're making there.
Okay. Well, it's the distinction between one individual and the differences in the population. So if height is 90% heritable, it could be that if you were short, it could be that for you, it's entirely due to the environment. You had some bad illness or something when you were very young. That's why you're so short. You would have been very tall, say, if you hadn't had that illness. So that's one individual. And we're talking about, on average, in the population, over 90% of the differences between people in height are due to genetics, inherited DNA differences. But that's an average in the population. And for any one person, it could be entirely environmental. So that's an important distinction, because, we'll get into it later as we talk about traits that are more provocative than height, like behavioral traits, like mental health and illness, cognitive abilities.
So just to rephrase what you said, to make sure that I understand, you're saying 90% of the reason why we are tall or short, or the height, is basically genetics, but 10% of the thing is based on the environment. But it doesn't. So for one person to another, it doesn't matter if it's 90 or 10%. It can change completely.
It's an average in the population. So on average, by far, the biggest reason why people differ in height is genetics. So if you think about other traits, we're asking about schizophrenia, for example, a common, one of the most important psychiatric disorders. Why do people differ? Why are some schizophrenic and others not? And for a century in psychology, people assumed it was nurture. It was due to the environment. More specifically, even Freud said it was really due to the way your mother treated you in the first few years of life. For 100 years, people didn't really think about genetics. But it turns out that schizophrenia has nothing to do with what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. It's one of the most heritable, most genetically influenced psychiatric disorders. And so we're saying, why are some people schizophrenic and others not? We're talking about differences between people. I hope that helps a little.
Yes, I understand 100% what you're saying. So, with that being said, though, where you draw the line? Why some stuff are fully focused by DNA and why some stuff are fully focused by nature? So,
Well, the thing
how
we
do
found
you?
out over the last, say, 20, 30 years is that just about everything shows genetic influence. There's some things that are somewhat less heritable, that is more due to the environment than others. But really, even in psychology, on average, 50% of the differences between people across hundreds of traits is due to genetic differences. And that's such a shocking finding because when I started graduate school in 1970, psychology was entirely environmentalistic. It assumed that everything we are, our personality, our mental health and illness, our cognitive abilities, everything was due to the environment. And now we know everything is significantly influenced by genetics. Nothing is totally influenced by genetics. So there's nothing that's deterministic. It's not hardwired. It's just that genetics plays a much larger role than anyone ever thought. And in psychology, the range is only from, say, 40% for personality traits, like how sociable you are, how neurotic you are, to about 60% for cognitive abilities. But on average, all psychological traits show 50% heritability. That means 50% of the differences between people are due to genetic differences. So that's been a huge revelation in psychology. And when I started 50 years ago, it was really kind of dangerous to even talk about genetic influence. People were still recovering from Nazi Germany and eugenics. And so it was very dangerous to even talk about genetic influence. But in the last 50 years, a mountain of evidence of many different types has all converged on the conclusion that the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals is our inherited DNA differences, genetics.
Why we draw these conclusions? Like what studies, how we came to these
Right.
things.
Yeah, that's what behavioral genetics is about. And that's what my book is about. It's called Blueprint, how DNA makes us who we are. So what the conclusion of the book is that inherited DNA differences are the major reason for why you are the way you are. Even though it's easy to think about environmental things, like if you ask people why, like in personality, pick a personality trait that you're high on, like what activity level, say, or maybe you're sociable, or maybe you're shy or emotional, but pick one. If people are listening to this, pick one thing that you're really kind of different from other people on, and just say, why are you that way?
Happy. I'm very happy.
You're happy. You're positive. You mean optimistic,
Yes.
good sense of well-being? Well,
Yeah.
lucky you. I mean, that's great. And then you ask, well, why are you that way? And before people hear about behavioral genetics, it's just easy to think about all the environmental things. Maybe your parents were particularly loving and supportive towards you. Maybe you just had a very nice childhood and you have a very good friends. So it's not crazy to think it's due to nurture. But in fact, it's due to genetics. And you see that in a lot, but
Mostly, you are saying mostly
mostly genetic. Yeah.
to genetic.
And the thing is, there's a lot of bits here to talk about all at the same time. And they're all described in my book, Blueprint. So to begin with, you asked, how do we know genetics is so important? And there are two main methods, the twin study and the adoption study. The twin study is like a biological experiment. Most people know there are two types of twins, identical twins and fraternal twins. So 1% of all twin births are twins, and a third of those are identical twins. They're called identical because they're monozygotic. One zygote, that is an egg and a sperm meet, that's a zygote. And that zygote then develops, but it splits into two separate zygotes. And those zygotes are genetically identical. If you sequence their DNA, they have the same DNA. So they're clones, basically. In the other type of twin, fraternal twins, are like any brother and sister. They're 50% similar genetically. If you sequence their DNA, half of their DNA will be the same, but half will be different. And so if a trait, like take a trait we don't know much about, musical ability, if it's heritable, you'd have to predict that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins, because identical twins are twice as similar genetically as fraternal twins. So if a trait were totally due to genetics, suppose musical ability is 100% due to genetics, you'd predict that identical twins are 100% similar and fraternal twins are not 0%, they're 50% similar genetically. And so you can estimate the extent to which genetics is important by the extent to which identical twin correlations are higher than fraternal twin correlations. So that's the twin method, and it's been used literally in thousands of studies. So that's been the workhorse in this area. The other method, though, is more like a social experiment. We know that things run in families, so children and parents are similar. Say for body weight, for example. People might be, well, I'll save the punchline till the end of this. For body weight, parents and offspring correlate 0.3. Now, people probably know that a correlation goes from 0 to 1, right? 1 is a perfect correlation. 0 means there's no relationship. So parents and offspring correlate 0.3. People have known that for 100 years. But why do they correlate? And everyone assumed it was due to nurture, which is not unreasonable, right? Parents give their kids they give the kid the food, they give them their role models for exercise and for diet and that sort of thing. But parents and offspring are 50% similar genetically. Could it be that the reason parents and offspring are similar for weight is genetics? And how do you test that? Well, the adoption method is a direct test of that, because you can study kids adopted away from their birth parents. They're like they're genetic relationships. So these kids are adopted away at birth from their biological parent, and then they grow up in an adoptive family. So those kids are still 50% similar genetically to their biological parents, but they're 0% similar genetically to their adoptive parents. So it's a direct test of genetic influence. So I said, if parents and offspring, there's no good word for it, natural parents, normal parents, who share genes and environment with their kid, they correlate 0.3. So the question is, what's the correlation between biological parents and their adopted away kids? And the answer is 0.3. You would correlate just as much with your biological parents for weight, even if you never saw them in your life.
So,
and then the other side of it, let me just finish the adoption design. The other side of it is the adoptive parents. So that would mean, if genetics accounts for parent-offspring resemblance, then what about adoptive parents and their adopted kids? They correlate 0. So if you grew up with adoptive parents, you were adopted away at birth, you wouldn't correlate with your weight, would not correlate with the weight of your adoptive parents at all. But it would correlate just the same with your biological parents as if they raised you. So that suggests that genetic influence accounts for family resemblance. And here's the other part of the story, and that is heritability is never 1. It's on average 50%. That means 50% of weight, for example, is due to non-genetic factors, environmental factors. But the surprise here was to realize it's not nurture in the sense of family environment. Because if you grow up with your adoptive parents and adoptive siblings, you're not genetically related to them, you won't be similar at all for weight. Growing up in the same family doesn't make you similar. But all of our theories of socialization from Freud onwards assume that that's the way the environment works. It's the family environment. It's your mother, particularly. A lot of Freudian stuff is mother blaming, for what goes wrong with you later in life. But this is saying the environment's important, but it's not the environment we always thought it was. Whatever it is, it's making two kids growing up in the same family different from one another. It's not making them similar. So for 30 years, people have been trying to find what they're called non-shared environmental factors are. And we really don't know. And I've come to conclude that it's basically chance, idiosyncratic, stochastic, random factors. Because there is a lot of randomness in life, accidents, illnesses, things like that. But that's quite shocking to think that after 30 years, we haven't really been able to identify what these environmental factors are that account for 50% of the differences between us. So the environment's important, but it's not the environment we thought was important. Now, the way these findings come together in the title of my book, which is Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, the conclusion is that DNA is the major systematic force making you who you are as an individual. The environment's important, but it's not operating in some systematic way. It's basically chance. So here's the bottom line. What I'm saying is that if you had been adopted away at birth, say there was a mistake in the maternity room and the wrong parents took you home. You grow up with the wrong parents in a different family, different friends, different school, everything's different. I'm saying you'd be just the way you are now. You'd be just the same as if you grew up with your identical twin, because you're genetically identical to yourself, right? I mean, you'd be the same person genetically. But the fact that you grew up in one family versus another family has no effect. So I know it's really shocking, isn't it? But it isn't just hypothetical. I don't know if your listeners have seen this film that won Sundance a couple of years ago. It's called Three Identical Strangers. Are you familiar with that? It's the story of
No.
not identical twins, but identical triplets. So identical twins is one zygote splits in the first few days of life. Sometimes one of those split again. So you've got three identical triplets in this case. And it's the story of, it starts with this guy, Bobby, who grew up in one of the wealthiest areas in New York, Long Island. And when he went, at the age of 19, he went to university in upstate New York. And on the first day at university, his name's Bobby, everyone was calling him Eddie, and they pretended like they knew him. And so he thought this was some weird psychology experiment. He's looking around for the hidden cameras. But then he met Eddie, and it was like looking in the mirror. And they quickly worked out that they had the same birth date and that they were both adopted, and they had been adopted from an adoption agency in Brooklyn. So that created a lot of publicity, and it raised a third one. That's why they're called identical triplets, Dave. So the weird thing, too, is Bobby was in a very wealthy family. Eddie was in a middle-class family whose father was, he was a lower-class family. His father was an immigrant who had just a corner shop sort of thing. And Dave, the third one, was raised in a middle-class family whose father was a high school teacher. So weird. These guys are raised in as different families as you can expect. And then you see them in this film, and you almost can't tell them apart physically. That's because physical characteristics, eye color, height, weight, everything is very strongly genetic. But the more surprising thing is how similar they are in personality. You'll see from the film and the photos, they're very outgoing. And what you don't see from the photos is that they were also very depressive. They seem very happy, easygoing guys, but they actually were all depressive. They didn't know of the existence of each other till they were 19. But in adolescence, they were all treated for depression. And that was very unusual. They were growing up in the 50s. And in the 1950s, it was very rare for an adolescent to be treated for depression. And then they were similar also academically, which interests me a lot. I'm particularly interested in educational performance. And they're the type of student that I like, actually, but they don't like school. They're clearly very bright. They like to read, they like to argue, but they don't like school. They found it kind of constraining. And so the cool thing was, after they met at college, two of them were in college together, and the other one was at another college. They all dropped out of university and they moved to Manhattan and they started a nightclub called Triplets that made $1 million in the first year. So, it was sort of a way in which genetics helps you. The environment isn't out there happening to us. The environment works more like this. They decide they don't really like school and that they're just going to drop out of school. And what they like is wildlife and nightclubs. And they set up this bachelor pad that became famous in Manhattan. And they like the nightlife. They like meeting a lot of people. They like the stimulation of that sort of life. It was a way, their environment isn't what happens to you. To a greater extent, experience is what you make of the environment. You select environments and modify them and create environments that are correlated with your genetic propensities. So it's like you make your environment. It's not like the environment makes you. And that's a lot to kind of take in, but I think it's very important. Like when people are depressed or whatever, they blame it on their parents, for example. There's a huge tendency now to blame everything that goes wrong in your life on your parents. But what I said is really what your parents did doesn't make a lot of difference, in the normal range. Now, clearly, if you were locked in a closet or beaten or abused, that's a different story. But within the range of populations that we study, genetics is the major systematic force making you who you are as individuals. So the only reason I'm on a crusade about this is because it's part of understanding who we are. If you think about who you are, people often think, well, it's what your parents did to you, it's early life, but it isn't. It's really mostly genetic. So to understand yourself, it's important that you understand these genetic tendencies that you have. Not to say you can't change them, but it's part of understanding who you are. For example, shyness is a highly heritable personality trait. And in America, it's sort of a pathology to be shy. If you've ever sat on an airplane with an American, they'll tell you your whole life story and their sex life and everything, and they think of British as, I'm an American in Britain, so I can say these things. They think of the British as, really uptight, but the British would think the Americans are just weird, to just tell a stranger everything about themselves. But shyness is, to a large extent, heritable. It's one of the more heritable personality traits. And so even within America, I was never very outgoing. I was kind of shy. And, you think you're kind of weird because of that. But if you say, no, well, there's genetic influence on that. And as you go through life, you get less and less concerned about what other people think. And I don't like to go to cocktail parties where there's a lot of people I don't know. I'm always surprised that there are people who love that. They think, wow, that's great and stimulating. I don't like it. And as I get older, I don't think I'm weird. I just think that's the way I am. And if I don't like to go to cocktail parties, I don't go to cocktail parties. So I think it's important that actually, the older you get, the more you become who you are, I think. You become less concerned about what other people think about you, and I think that's probably a good thing. It may be why older people are happier on average. There's this U-shaped function. People are happy, in early adulthood or whatever, but in middle life, maybe it's kids, maybe it's just the drudgery of day-to-day life or whatever, but they become much less happy. But then after that, in the 60s and 70s, on average, health, given reasonable health, people are generally fairly happy. And I wonder to what extent that is that they're just more accepting of who they are, what their life is. And, I think that's a good thing. Sorry, I've been babbling on here, but...
So, no, I love this. You are saying interesting stuff. That's why I'm not interfering. So, why you are what you are saying you think is super important?
Well, because from a scientific point of view, it's because we always assumed everything in psychology is environmental, and now we know everything systematic in psychology is genetic. Genetics is the major systematic force making us who we are. So that turns psychology on its head. For parents, it's important because if you're a parent and you think kids are a blob of clay and you're going to make them be what you want them to be, you're in for a world of hurt. It's going to be very unhappy for you. Because, say, for example, 1% of the population gets diagnosed in their life as schizophrenic. That's a very severe mental disorder where you lose touch with reality. It's very bad news. And so I often get emails from people who say, they did everything they could for their kid. And then you don't find out that they're schizophrenic until they're in their late teens or early 20s. And then what you used to be told by the Freudian types is, well, it's what the mother did to the kid in the first few years of life. How wicked is that? Because you can't change the first few years of life. But worse than that, it's wrong. It's totally wrong. There's no evidence for that. So if you think your kids became schizophrenic, it must be because of what you did, because everything's environmental. That's pretty tough to take. And that's why parents of kids who became psychotic, that's either schizophrenic or bipolar, depressive, they're big supporters of genetic research, because they come to realize that they didn't do that to their kid, And so it's important for parents to realize, not just for negative things like that, but, you still hear parents who, if you're athletic, you want your kid to be a gold medal, winner in the Olympics or something. And it doesn't mean you can't do anything. You can push your kid to do a lot better than they would have. But if your kid doesn't have the body to be a marathon runner, you're not going to make them a marathon runner. You're not going to make them an elite athlete anyway. You can do something.
But how much is that something? How much you can influence that is the real question.
Not much at all. So if you think about athletics, if your kid hasn't got the body to be a runner, you could still run with your kid. You could make them run better than they were running, but it's an uphill battle. And kids aren't stupid. I tried to make my kids learn piano, and just because they inherited my orneriness, they said, "Oh, you want me to play piano? Great. I'm not going to play piano." And, they're musically oriented, but they didn't want to take lessons. I felt to be a civilized person, you have to be able to read music, and that was a dumb thing to do because some kids love music and they'll learn it. Other kids hate it. But now I could make them learn to read music, and I did. But it was a great mistake because there was a lot of cost to that. They were rebelling against it the whole time. It was a bone of contention. I said, no, before you go out and play, you have to practice the piano. What was the point of that? And because they weren't dumb, they looked at their friends, and some of their friends were composing music. They didn't have music lessons. But nowadays, you don't need a teacher. You've got Spotify and all of this online resource stuff. So kids with musical talent, you almost can't stop them from becoming good at music. Because, it's not that they need the best teachers in the world. They'll just hang out with kids who like music. They'll start forming bands. They'll start composing music. Their genetics will push them in the direction they want to go. So my message to parents is, don't try to make your kid into something you want them to be. Give them the opportunities to find out what they like to do and what they're good at. And then if they find something, help them as best you can to do it. So mostly
because
for me,
you don't know what is their genetic tendencies. So the best thing to do is just allow them to explore and find their genetic tendencies by
Right. Well,
themselves.
something else we might get into, though, is now the DNA revolution allows us to predict what kids are good at. So there's a bunch of companies
Okay.
now called Map My Gene is one, and they do talent testing for children. Now, they're not great predictors, but you can predict athletic ability, to some extent with genetics, but you don't even need the genetics. If you see these athletically gifted people, they didn't inherit an ability to play tennis. For example, we're missing Wimbledon now as we record the semifinals of Wimbledon. I can tell you're not a tennis buff, but do you know Wimbledon is the tennis match in England?
Yes, I know,
Yeah.
but I am not a very tennis fan.
Yeah, well, they're doing the semifinals right at this minute. It's very interesting this year. But, if you pick the famous athletes, they weren't they weren't inheriting ability for tennis. It involves eye-hand coordination. Most athletes, even talk to these tennis players, they like basketball, they played football, they were good at a lot of sports. They had a lot of things going for them: the speed, the reaction time, the hand-eye coordination. There's things you need to be a good athlete. And we can predict some of that with genetics. And elite athletes are doing this now. We have the baseball teams, football teams. They all want that little bit of edge. Even if you could predict a little bit, it can make a big difference in an elite athlete. But with kids, you could predict this kid's going to be a klutz. Like you could predict their height and weight very well as an adult. And if you thought your kid was going to be a basketball player, and I tell you, your kid is going to be below average in height and fat, it's not a very good bet. Now, even in that case, though, you could say, I want my kid to be a basketball player. You can give them coaches. And in childhood or whatever, they could get to be pretty good. But are they going to play basketball? No, because, they know they're no good at it.
So with how much accuracy we can predict the weight and the
You
height
can predict
of people?
about 20. So it's about 60% heritable. The differences between people are often surprised by that. 60% heritable, body mass index, weight. That means of the differences you see in your friends, 60% of those differences are due to genetics, which is surprising because a lot of people think, well, it's just a matter of not eating like a pig and exercising and all of that. But it isn't. I mean, people like me who have a genetic tendency to put on weight, it's really a battle, to not eat so much, to watch your diet. Skinny people like you probably don't have, they often think, well, stop being such a pig, and just in England, they say, pull your socks up, get your act together. But it isn't
Yes.
like that. There really
Stop
is
being a pussy.
yeah, genetic, the genetics is really important here. And we can explain, it's 60% heritable. We can explain 20% of the differences between people with DNA. And the thing about that is we can predict that at birth because your DNA does not change through life, which is kind of amazing. That one cell with which we begin life, half the DNA is from your mother, half from your father. That unique set of DNA is the same DNA in all of the trillions of cells in your body. And it doesn't change throughout life. So,
can you predict how much money people will make in their lives?
Income actually is not as heritable as most things, but it's still 40% heritable. And why that is, partly it involves intelligence. It involves things that you don't inherit income, obviously. Well, you do actually. A lot of people inherit. That's the reason it's not so heritable. I think to some extent, income is a matter of what you inherit from your parents, one way or another. Like they give you better opportunities for schooling and that sort of thing. But right now, we can predict about probably a little less than 10% of the variance in ultimate income people will make as an adult. Do you know what I mean? Like when you reach your sort of peak of occupational status or whatever. So increasingly, we are able to predict with DNA alone how people are doing, but it's always probabilistic, and we can never make a perfect prediction because all these traits are less than 100% heritable. Now, height, which is 90% heritable, we can predict getting on almost 40, 50% of the variance. So we could predict with pretty good accuracy how tall kids are going to be. And you might say, well, sure, look at the parents. If the parents are tall, the kids are tall. But actually, I mean, that's true on average. But you'll have tall parents who have short kids, and you'll have most of the tallest kids come from parents of average height. And the reason for that is there are relatively few very tall parents. That's this normal bell-shaped curve, the normal distribution it's called. And many more of the kids in the next generation will come from parents in the middle, because 90% of all the kids who are born have parents who are more in the middle. And yet they're very different. You know, I'm sure most of your listeners probably have examples where in a family, one sibling is tall and another sibling is short. Kids differ in height within a family. Now, the environment has trouble explaining that. How do you explain it environmentally? Did the parents feed one kid better than the other? Unlikely. But genetics predicts that kids in a family are different from one another. And that's another important message for parents. You know, people who go to university find it very hard when one of their kids say they don't like school and, you know, they don't want to go to university. That's really hard for university parents to accept. But you got to recognize that kids are different. And rather than pushing them to do what you want them to do, it's far better to figure out what they like to do and help them do it. You know, mostly I tell parents, just relax more. You don't make as much of a difference as you think you do. And what you should do is realize this is the longest relationship in your life. Why spoil it by trying to force them into being something you want them to be? I think the enjoyment from parenting comes from watching your kids become who they are, rather than trying to make them into what you want them to be, because that isn't going to work very well.
So you are basically saying if you want to influence your kids, the most important decision in your life is to who you marry.
Well, the most important thing in your life is who your parents are, but you can't do much about that. Who your parents are, yeah. And but you're right. Picking your spouse it's sort of like eugenics, though, isn't it? You're sort of changing the genes to be the way you want them to be. But you know, we do that naturally. Do you know it's called assortative mating? I don't know if in your language there's in English we say birds of a feather flock together. Similar people are attracted to people who are like them. Birds of a feather flock together. The other one, though, the other adage is opposites attract. You know, people think, well, no, you like to hang out with people who are different from you because they're stimulating. But it isn't the case. Assortative mating is always positive. We do tend to find people who are similar to us in personality, in height. You probably see that in height. You know, that tall guys tend to marry tall women on average. It isn't very strong. The strongest assortative mating is for intelligence. So people, you know, sometimes say, oh, how can you measure intelligence? Well, you can measure intelligence in 5 minutes in a singles bar, because you talk to the person and you get a sense very quickly about their verbal ability, vocabulary, sort of their intelligence. I mean, they talk intelligently. You know, you sort of know what that is. And if you're intelligent, you will very quickly see that someone's intelligent. Now, that doesn't mean in a one-night stand, you know, that you care very much about that. But when you start, you know, waking up in the morning with the person and you have to talk to them all day long, it becomes very important that you're kind of matched in terms of intellectual, because it's not just ability, it also influences what you like to do. Do you know? So assortative mating is an important factor. And in the 60s, when I was in college, um, there, uh, there was a sense of, well, I knew many women who didn't, this is the days of women's lib, in the 60s and 70s. And I knew several women in Boulder, Colorado, which was a pretty wild place where I went to graduate school. And a lot of women were saying they wanted to have kids, but they didn't want a man. They just wanted some sperm. And I knew three women who just went out to a singles bar, picked up some guy for the night, and had a kid. Didn't tell the father about it, because at that time people thought it's all tender, loving care. You just are nice to your kid and loving to your kid, and everything will be fine. They really thought that, and I hope that sounds preposterous to people hearing this, but people really did believe it at the time. And, it still happens now. A lot of parents who put off having kids till later in life and spend a lot of their youth not getting pregnant and having abortions, when they want to have a kid, they can't have a kid, and they adopt. And I still know parents who think, well, it doesn't matter. You just get any old kid and it's going to be fine. And that's fine if you don't care. If they go to university, you don't care, what they're like. But I have one adopted child and one of my own children, and you really see it.
Oh, wow.
Well, I inherited a
Wow.
kid from a woman I was with who died. So it wasn't like regular adoption. But, say if you're university educated and you adopt a kid, the average IQ in the population is 100. So if you're lucky, you'll get a kid with an average IQ of 100. The average IQ of kids who go to university is 115. The average IQ of people who graduate from university is 125. And, so the kid with the average IQ of 100 is unlikely to go to university. And if they did, if you push them to do it, because, you're an educated parent, you want your parent to go to your kid to go to university, the kid would, it'd be a tough go for the kid. And that can almost be worse, because then they fail at university. Instead, they might have said, well, I want to do some vocational electronics. How about programming? I think we need a lot more people who are trained for real occupations where there's a job at the end of it, like they do in Europe, especially Switzerland and Germany, where that's a really important track after high school, after compulsory school. You can go into apprenticeship training where you get paid to go to university, or, for training in, say, programming, and then you have a job at the end of it. It kills me that these kids in university now, many of them want to do psychology, film studies. There's no job at the end of it, and they're flipping hamburgers at McDonald's, So I really don't think, parents really need to realize that kids are different, and even their genetically related kids will be different from one another. And this is sort of important to me because I grew up in a family. I had one sister, and I learned to read early. I loved to read. I went to school. I did well at school. And my sister didn't do any of those things. She was late to learn to read. She never liked reading. And she didn't like going to school. She wasn't good at it. And if you think everything's environmental, then you think, well, I deserve a lot of credit because I did well at school. And what's wrong with her? Is she lazy or whatever? But it's not. We're just different genetically. And she's very good at some things. She ended up being head of a blood technicians, a lab where they do blood testing in hospitals, because she's very good at that, very responsible, attention to detail, things that I wouldn't be. I mean, I couldn't stand doing those sort of routine, life determining jobs. If you make a mistake there, someone can die, So, but she thrives on it. So she found her niche in life, and I found mine. But to think that it's environmental is a big mistake, I believe. So I think it's very important for parents to get this message that genetics is much more important than they probably thought. And environmentally, they don't have as much control as they think they do. I mean, they can make the kid's life
Not
pretty
only
miserable.
parents, not only parents though, like this is a very freeing idea when you are just for everyone. It's like you are more relaxed when you understand that actually. So basically, you are saying with all the stuff that you said that basically is mostly genetic stuff, and even if it's if we can control behavior or something, it's based on lack of the environment or something. It's not
Yeah, that
too
the
much stuff
environment's
that you
mostly
can do
chance.
about stuff.
Yeah, the environment's chance, so you don't have control over chance. Now, what people say is, well, does that
Yes.
mean I can't do anything as a parent? Well, you can. You could make your kid's life pretty miserable. You could, like in adolescence, you could force them to have piano lessons when they don't want to have piano lessons. You can make their life pretty miserable. But if you're thinking you're going to make a difference in the long run, you're going to affect how their mental health and illness, how well they do at school, you won't make nearly as much difference as you think. So I think here's a good analogy. If you're thinking of getting married or someone and you want to find a spouse, if you pick someone and said, well, they're not bad. I could make something good of them. You know, I'll have them do this and I'll have them do that, and I'll make them be the person I want them to be. You know, that's a disaster. You do things for people you love because you love them. You want life to be nice for them. So I don't do stuff for my wife because I'm trying to make her be something I want her to be. You know, if she doesn't like, I like blues. She doesn't like blues. She likes classical music. I don't force her to go to blues things hoping I'll get her interested in blues. You know, we kind of compromise. I go to classical stuff sometimes, she goes to stuff. So you do stuff for people you love because you love them and you want life to be nice for them. You don't do it for them because you're trying to make them into something you want them to be. Now that sounds crazy with a spouse, but that's what people do with their kids. They think they're doing things for their kids because they want them to be the person they think they ought to be. Instead, it ought to be like a spouse. You do stuff for them because you want life to be nice for them. You want them to be happy. And that doesn't mean letting them do anything they want to do. I mean, if they're getting into drugs or whatever, you say, this is not going to be good for you. You know, in my opinion, you're seriously endangering your life. And if you see that they like certain things, you help them do it, not because you're trying to make them into something. You just want them to be happy. So it's an important distinction, but I think parents ought to enjoy being parents because they're not going to make much of a difference anyway.
Robert, I think you are a bit of a bad person because you destroyed the motivational industry of teaching everyone, making everyone think that they can do everything themselves and they can be a billionaire themselves. And
Exactly right.
with
Or
the
as
stuff
they
that
say
I
in
understood
America,
is
as
that
they
you
say in America, they say anyone can be president. And with Trump, that almost appears to be true, doesn't it? No, but it's kind of wicked to
but
say.
you are,
I know what you're saying. Is it sounds bad to say. I'm basically saying you can't be anything you want to be. You can try to be better at something than you are, but if you think you're going to be an Olympic marathon runner or sprinter or play at Wimbledon in tennis, it's a dumb thing to think. You better to say, no, look, I'm good at these things. I like to do these things, so I'll try to do those things. So it's bad to say you can be anything you want to be, because then if you're not what you want to be, like a billionaire,
then it's your fault.
Your fault. Yep. And in the past, it would have been your
And
parents'
then you
fault.
are miserable.
Yeah.
And then you are miserable because you think, the other people did something right and I did something wrong, and like you start. So yes, so
Yeah.
it's
Exactly
kind
right.
of revolutionizing the world. This idea is like the world is not living with this idea in mind. And it's like all these motivational, all the successful, most of the successful people, they say, yes, you can do it and all this stuff, but they forget that they are there because of their genetic behavior and not because they did something right and they were lucky.
Yeah. Well, it could be, that they worked very hard. Elon Musk, is a maniac for working. I mean, it wasn't just luck that made him get where he was, but he's obviously very smart, very motivated, and still
I
he
think it's
almost
luck.
failed.
Is aren't you said that it's luck. Basically, what you're saying is mostly luck. So being in
No,
that
it's
position, or to
genetics,
any
and the
billionaires.
environmental side of it is luck. Like with Tesla, he got within a few weeks of total bankruptcy. He was sleeping on the factory floor. It wasn't like handed to him on a gold platter, but he has that drive and competitiveness and intelligence to want to be where he is. Now, I wouldn't change places with him in a million years. I mean, I don't want to be the world's richest person. I want to be happy. I want to feel like I live a rewarding life, do you know? But you got to find out what.
Clever Robert.
No, well, think about what you like in life and what you're good at, and you know, um, and I'm sure Elon Musk, is probably happy in his own way, in his own autistic sort of way.
But I think what you're mentioning is kind of now it becomes increasingly more important if you are saying is right to really be self-aware, like Socrates said, and reverse engineer what we like and make some, and not be forced by the society that we need to do something else.
Yes, yeah, to be happier in yourself. That's why I think a lot of this mindfulness stuff is very good for people to think about. We often don't think about. We don't use our intelligence to think about ourselves as much as we ought to. You know, and but that's not my expertise. But I do think part of understanding ourselves is to realize how important genetics is. Not to say you can't change it. Like I say, you can predict obesity pretty well. My highest DNA risk score is for obesity. That is, I'm at the 95th percentile on the DNA score for obesity. And it's been a lifelong sort of battle. It's easy for me to put on weight. It's hard for me to lose it. The old story. But people say, well, okay, then I'm just going to, you can't tell people it's genetic because then they're just going to throw up their hands and say, I can't do anything about it. But actually, I find it very motivating, and many people do. You realize it is genetic, it's biological, and I'm in a battle here, battle of the bulge. It's just a lot easier for me to put on weight. It's a lot harder to lose it. So I've got to fight harder if I want to lose weight, you know? So knowing that it's genetic actually helps me because this isn't just like me being a lazy slob. It's just biologically, I have good genes because back 10,000 years ago, when we didn't know when we were going to get the next meal, the genes I have that put on weight, fat, were good because fat is how you store energy. And when you don't know when you're going to get your next meal, it's very good to have these genes that have you put on fat. But in a fast food world, we've got our Stone Age brain in a fast food nation, bombarded by food cues. So now those good genes become bad genes. So anyway, I find it very motivating, and I don't at all find it doesn't at all make me feel like, well, okay, nothing I can do about it. I'm going to be a genetic fatty and that's it. So I think that's generally true. Like with alcoholism, if we could predict that you have a genetic tendency to be alcoholic, now it doesn't mean you're going to be alcoholic. It just means other things being equal, you have more of a risk for alcoholism. But if you knew that, there are low-tech solutions. Like if you don't drink a lot of alcohol for a long time, you're not going to become alcoholic. People have this misconception if the alcoholism has a genetic component, one sip of alcohol and you're going to be hooked on alcohol. It's not like that. So if you're worried about it, you just do what we're all supposed to do. Take holidays from booze. Just monitor your drinking, because if if you had a kid who had a genetic risk for this in adolescence, where they all go out and get bombed a lot, you say, well, you are more at risk than your friends. So just pay more attention to it. Don't just slip into it where you become dependent on it. And, because it is invidious. It doesn't happen one day. You don't wake up alcoholic. This is over many years of more and more drinking, and then you become dependent on it. You don't feel like you can go to a party or socialize unless you're hammered. So
So
anyway, I think this genetic message is
ha-
positive. That's how you started, that this is kind of a liberating message, not just for parents, but also for ourselves. And that's
yes, and
exactly what.
when you know the data, you can reverse engineer and do what you did with a lot more relaxation, like you describe with the weight. You have weight tendencies, so it's very beautiful to see. But how do I understand, and how people can understand what's their genetic tendencies? Is there tests to do? Is like just paying attention to your self
Well,
awareness or something?
that's
How
what we're
people
trying to.
understand this?
That's what we're trying to do now with the DNA revolution, is to actually find the genes that predict this genetic influence. So all of medicine is doing this now. It's the big thing in medicine. It's called preventive medicine. So the way medicine and psychiatry worked until recently is you wait until someone has a disease, like you have a heart attack. Medicine is oriented towards fixing that once it happens. But once you have a bad heart attack, your life is pretty shit afterwards in a way. There's a decreased quality of life. I mean, it might have killed you for one thing, but even if it doesn't, there's a lot to pay. So instead, if you could predict who's going to have a heart attack, you could prevent it. And you can prevent it with low-tech solutions. And so the best predictor in town is DNA. So you can predict about, I think it's something like 12% of the liability towards heart attacks. So what that means is you could say, if you do men particularly, because men are particularly at risk for these early onset heart attacks, in adulthood, these massive sort of heart attacks that are especially dangerous. I think it's something like the top 5% are at a tenfold greater risk. So if you get the DNA from someone, which I'm sure people are familiar with it, like 23andMe, you just take a swab in the inside of your mouth. Well, during COVID testing, that's a DNA test. So you get some DNA, and then we genotype your DNA, and I can tell you, are you in that top 5% of risk? Because if you are, you're probably perfectly healthy as a young man. But I'd say you're actually at a tenfold greater risk of having one of these severe heart attacks than other people. So then we can prevent it. Rather than waiting till you have a heart attack, we can try to prevent that heart attack from happening. Because economically, socially, and personally, that's so much better than trying to deal with problems after they've occurred. And so what do you do about it if you have a high risk for heart attacks? It's the same stuff we're all supposed to do. Lose weight, eat better, exercise more, monitor your blood pressure. Low tech, doesn't cost a thing really. But if you knew you were at that tenfold greater risk for having a heart attack, you might pay attention. Whereas the rest of us just ignore this sort of advice, this public health sort of advice. But you can go beyond that now. There are more expensive treatments that can predict, like whole body scans. You can actually predict, you can show that your arteries are starting to fuzz up, and you can do something about it before they actually occlude, before they fuzz up so much that you have a heart attack. So I think it's just so exciting because it's going to change medicine, and it's going to change everything to know about the DNA. And rather than talking about it abstractly, like weight is 60% heritable, we can say, no, your risk score, if you were like me, is at the 95th percentile for obesity. So I can predict that you are definitely going to be heavier than other people. You're going to find it harder to stay fit and thin. than other people. And then what do you do with that? Well, there's things you can do. And I don't know if you've been following the excitement about semaglutide. It's the thing all the Hollywood A-listers are using now. Do you know about this at all? It's an injection once a
No.
week of a glutide. It was first set up for insulin. If you have if you're diabetic, you need to get insulin shots to control your blood sugar levels. If they get too low, you go into a seizure. So here you can semaglutide breaks one of those chains. So it was used initially for diabetics, but then it was found that it made people lose weight. And I know there's all these fads about weight reduction, but this is one that's been going on for 2 years, and it works. It works so well, you can't even buy the stuff now because there's a global shortage, an international shortage, because it's in such demand, because it really works. So I started it about 5 months ago, and I've lost, being American, I still think in pounds, but I've lost 10 kilos since
Which about
January.
20 pounds. Wow.
Exactly right. And the neat thing about it is it's not, it just makes you like a normal person, in the sense that if there's food on the table before, like you go to a restaurant, you're with friends, people say, do you want some more? No, I'm full. But then as the food sits there, I start eating the other person's chips, and, are you going to finish that meat? And I just keep eating even after I really am full. But normal people would feel like, no, when I'm full, if you make me eat more, I'm going to get sick. Well, that's what the semaglutide does to you. It just makes you feel normal. You say, no, I really am full. I don't want any more food. And for the first time in as long as I can remember, I'll actually leave food on my plate, like at a restaurant. Even though it's very good food, I don't eat every last scrap now. It's really quite amazing. And I don't crave food the same way I used to. And the amazing thing is it has very few side effects. You'd think something that does something like that might affect you in a lot of other ways, but it doesn't affect your zest for life. It doesn't make, you could give people drugs that would just be downers. They would just make them, depressed and not wanting anything. It's not at all like that, though. It's very specific to food. So that to me is, in a way, kind of evidence for the biological aspect of it, because this has nothing to do with. You could probably give it to somebody if they didn't know it, and they would lose weight. It really, you can do more if you're motivated, and you do the weight control sort of methods, eat smaller amounts of food and eat slowly. Those sorts of tricks definitely help. But semaglutide would have you lose weight even if you didn't know you were taking it. So anyway, that's rather cool from my point of view, because that's the one thing I have. It's my greatest health problem, I'd say.
So I think is when you were describing all this stuff, I was like, oh wow! So it's a lot more optimistic. The pharma industry and like this preventing stuff, because there is, if you prevent the disease with all this stuff that you are measuring, we are talking about huge change in everything in life. Like,
Yeah.
for example, now the pharma is some big thing, but if we change our focus to understand, because prevention means a lot of things a lot of times, like, but when we actually know what we need to prevent, and like it becomes more and we can detect it, it will change the whole, it will expand lifespan for sure. That just
One good example of that, though, is in terms of heart attacks. It's said that if you could prevent one severe heart attack from occurring, just one, you save on the order of 800,000 euros. Because, if you go to the hospital and you have a severe heart attack, you're in intensive care for a while, and treatments and instead, if you could prevent one from happening, you're talking about nearly €1 million. So imagine what it would do
Wow.
for the health service
Wow.
if you could do that. And so that's why medicine has completely gone over to this idea of preventive medicine. And I think in psychology and psychiatry, that's the way we ought to go too. Because once someone becomes alcoholic, it's you can treat it, you can have people not be on alcohol, and AA works fairly well, but in a said, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. You're a recovered alcoholic, but you're still an alcoholic. That is, you could easily go off the wagon again if you started drinking. The same thing's true with a lot of things, even schizophrenia. Once you've had a major schizophrenic episode, it's very hard to lead a normal life after that. You can, with the drugs don't work all that well. But with any of these things, if we could work to prevent these things, rather than putting all of our energy into finding the drugs to help people after they've had this problem, like alcoholism or a heart attack, try to prevent it, not just with drugs, though, but with, in psychiatry, I think with prevention. So, like depression is probably the biggest problem in society now. And I do believe that I don't know if you know cognitive behavior therapy. It's the main treatment for depression these days, which is really just healthy thinking. It's sort of like mindfulness in a way. You don't ruminate on bad things. You think about what makes you depressed, and you try to avoid that. You try to do positive things. Instead of treating people who are depressed, why not give people that training before they're depressed? Why not give everybody this sense of healthy living and cognitive behavior therapy and mindfulness? It's it it just seems to make such good sense, because the neat thing about those things, they're not going to hurt you. They're good for you. It'd be good for everyone to learn about mindfulness.
Yes,
And
but why not to just detect it that you have this behavior, and then you get an education and you prevent it from happening in the future? That
well,
seems
because very
that
often, by the time you get a severe depressive episode, and we're not just talking about feeling blue here, the psychotic depression, major depressive disorder, you're hospitalized for it. You don't eat, you don't sleep, you can't work, you don't have a life anymore. This isn't just feeling a little unhappy. I mean, you say you're a positive, optimistic, happy person, so it's probably hard to understand how, I mean, we're talking about very severe depression here. And once that happens, your life starts to fall apart. And you can't put your life back
is
together again so
so,
easily.
sorry for interrupting. Sorry for interrupting, but I yes, I'm very happy, and a lot of times when other people are saying that they are not happy, I'm like, like we said before, yes, you pussy, you need to
Yeah.
just be happy. But now with our conversation, sorry, I'll change behavior.
Yeah. Well, it is important. So you said it was liberating for us and as parents, but it's also humanistic in a way. And, just as you're saying, it makes us be more understanding of other people, to recognize that people are different genetically, and to respect those differences to a greater extent. To say, life might, might look at your friend who's depressed and you say, you pussy, your life is good. What's wrong with your life? Well, that's you. You would say, I wouldn't be unhappy in that situation, but it isn't the situation. It's him. It's that person. And they can be genetically more predisposed to uh, experiencing life badly. And part of that, I think, is things like mindfulness. It's how you interpret things. The same thing can happen for two people, and they can respond very differently. Someone can you can be embarrassed, you can like screw up or something like that, and one person might not notice it. Like happy people like you and me, optimistic people, you don't even notice it, but for the other person it's devastating. For days they won't sleep. They'll think about, I can't believe that guy did that to me. And so they ruminate about it, and they just dig themselves into a hole. And you know we might say, well, come on, get out of it, don't be a pussy. But it's just easier for us to say. And if you've ever experienced that depth of depression, it's real. Yeah, it isn't something just to say, come on, pull your socks up, don't be a pussy. In fact, that of course makes it a lot worse because, you know, they're saying, well, you think it's just because I'm a pussy.
And you make them believe that with this behavior, you make them believe that, oh, maybe they are just better, or maybe I can work on this. And then and it's like, you think you can do 100, but your capability is 20. And then you are miserable because your expectations are
Yeah.
off.
And I do think we can change our lives. You can figure out, well, what makes you unhappy? I mean, you think if you were depressive, you might want to hang out with people like you who are optimistic, but it doesn't work that way, you know? I mean, if you're depressive, you
So
tend to
you
kind
don't
of hang
think we
out.
can, you think we can change our lives because with what you're saying, it seems that not to a great degree.
Well, parents don't make much of a difference on their kids. That's one thing. But in your life, like with my obesity, I have a strong genetic tendency to be heavy, to put on weight. But it doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. It just means in the population as a whole, genetics is very important. But I'm one person, and I can make a difference. It's going to be harder for me than it would be for you, but I can make a difference, and I am making a difference. I'm cheating now by using semaglutide. That makes it a lot easier. And see, in the end, suppose everyone took semaglutide. Everyone in the population would be thinner, but some of us would probably still be heavier than others. Because I probably won't lose weight. I mean, someone who's thin like you, it might even be dangerous to use semaglutide because you don't want to be too thin, you know? So I think even if everybody had semaglutide, there's probably still genetic differences between us. But it's an empirical question, because what we're doing is we're describing differences that exist in a particular population at a particular time. And if you change that population, like with semaglutide, or you say, well, 10 generations ago, it was very different because we didn't have the access to fat foods the way we do now. There was no junk food back then, So when the environment changes, then heritability can change. It's not, a constant like the speed of light.
So I want to understand something that you are explaining. I will try to give you an example to tell me if I understand. So basically, you are saying that if I'm born in Cyprus, I am from Cyprus. So if I was born in the United States with the same DNA, I was going to have a completely different life, but not because. But if I was going to be both in the United States, I'm more likely to have the same life. And this is what you mean by the surrounding and the environment, like the general surrounding.
Yeah.
And the language and the culture and all this stuff. This is
If
what
that
you
were the
mean,
case,
right?
if that were the case, then you would start telling everybody about your life when you're on an airplane. If you grew up in America, what I'm saying is that those cultural influences do have an effect on people, but we're talking about individual differences within a population. And certainly within America, there are people who are very shy, as well as people who are super, outgoing, of the sort I described. Yeah, so that's a good point. There are these identical twins reared apart, where I just heard about a pair recently where a pair of identical twins were adopted in China, and well, there's a famous pair. The most famous pair are called the Jim twins, where one twin grew up as a Hitler Youth in Germany, and the other twin grew up in Israel on a kibbutz. I mean, how about that?
That's funny.
And they met in middle-aged, and they hadn't known about each other's existence, but this Minnesota study brought them together in Minnesota for a week. And it was just like this film, Three Identical Strangers, where these kids, they were strangers to one another, but it was like they met themselves. They're close friends. They know each other, from the first meeting. It's really quite striking to see how these identical twins reared apart come together, even if they were reared in such different environments, like you're describing. But you almost can't get more different than being raised a Hitler Youth versus being raised on a kibbutz in Israel. And yet they were very similar, very similar to an eerie degree. I mean, like their hobby that they liked was carpentry, but it wasn't just carpentry. Maybe that's chance. They liked to build benches, circular benches around trees. I mean, what on earth is that? Do you know what I mean? That their interests
Both
were
of them.
so specific, both of them. And I think that's something we don't often get to, because they're identical genetically. That wouldn't show up in families, because you're only 50% similar. But if you have exactly the same genes, you can sometimes have very specific genetic differences. Like how many people in the world build circular benches around trees, wooden benches around trees. So these studies of identical twins reared apart are really quite amazing. And it makes your point, though, that if you grew up in a different culture, the culture would have an effect on you. That the world you're swimming in, basically. But the individual differences would still be strongly genetic.
Yeah, and especially like if you go to China or India or you go in Africa, there the environment is so much different. Maybe you don't have access to internet in the world's poorest country. And it's like, it's very interesting, the difference that will make in life. But you're saying it will make certain difference, but when it comes to individualness, like if you are a bit happier tendencies, if you like if you are introvert or outgoing,
Extrovert.
so this will be similar in both of the cultures.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right.
So with all this debate, all this time, not debate, like you teaching me stuff, all this time I have this question in mind. What about free will?
Well, that is Sam Harris, who, I know he did an interview with me. He has this nice podcast called Making Sense. And he talks a lot about free will. And he would say there's no such thing as free will. He would say everything's deterministic. And it's partly semantic, how you define these things. I mean, everything you do is based on your biology. You can't do anything if it isn't biology, right? I mean, you think because you've got a brain. Well, yeah, at that level, okay. I mean, you know what I'm saying? That you can, depending on how you define it, you can say, well, sure, your behavior comes from your biology in the sense that it takes a body and it takes a brain and all of that. But at the specific level of an act, like, do you now, I don't know, rub your chin like you're doing? You could say, oh no, I'm not going to do that. That's, you say, so I can make that decision. I can make that decision. But he would say no. I mean, and it seems kind of weird. I have trouble understanding it really, but he would say, if you could rewind that, if you could capture every bit of it, which you can't do, right? I mean, everything, every cell in your body, everything in the environment, it would work, it would come out the same, he would say. So in that sense, there isn't any free will. What you think is free will isn't free will. And I really don't get it. And, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm kind of anti-philosophical. I'm a scientist, and part of that is saying you try to find things that are tractable, problems you can solve. And there's lots of problems in the world, like, is there a God or whatever? These aren't sort of scientific questions. You can't really test that empirically. So as a scientist, I want to say, I can't answer all the questions. I don't know if there's free will or whatever, but give me a question I can test, I can solve, not hypothetically, like if you could rewind the last few minutes and play them over again. Okay, I think philosophers they're actually interested in problems that are not tractable, that are not empirically solvable. Because if you can solve it empirically, then there's no philosophical issue, right? There it is. Those are the data. Like the multiverse. How are we ever going to solve that empirically? Because that's where this stuff comes in, free will. They would say there's another universe somewhere where someone exactly like you is having exactly this conversation with someone like me. Well, maybe, but it doesn't interest me because I don't see that that's ever going to be an empirical sort of problem. But I mean, to each their own. Some people love to talk about those philosophical issues. I like to do science. I like to figure out what's a tractable problem. And I don't think the issue of is there free will is tractable. I would say there's less total free will than people think, in the sense that if you just think, if you don't think genetics is partly determining what you do, influencing what you do, it's not hardwired or deterministic. But if you don't think genetics is giving you these little pushes, then I think you're wrong. So to that extent, there's less free will than people think they have. You can take the most hyperactive kid and put a gun to their head and said, "Don't move or I'll shoot you." Well, they're not going to move. But that isn't free will, right? That kid will still be hyperactive in the real world, in the rest of the world. So I think there's less free will in that kind of global sense than people think when they don't accept the extent to which genetics is influencing what they do, not determining, but just influencing what they do. So that's kind of a cop-out, but I don't have a good answer to your question about
No,
what is
no,
reality.
no. It's very interesting because it's exactly what you described that raised my question, because what you are presenting is that we have less free will than we think we
That's
have.
true.
So that's why
Yeah, that's
I
a good
had
point. Yeah.
in mind all the time this question. So
Yeah.
you're basically saying that we have tendencies to become fatter. It doesn't, and if we can't change it, is by so much more effort. So it's like,
But there's still free will, right? So even though weight is highly heritable, and I have a strong genetic propensity, it doesn't mean I can't do anything about it. There is free will to the sense I can work really hard and not have any junk food in the house, for example. There are things I can do. So in that sense, there is free will, but it's just more limited than people think if they don't realize the extent to which genetics influences us. It's like whispers, it's not like we're puppets on a string and the genetics is making us do something. And in fact, the genetics can make you, like as you get older, you start to notice things in you that are like your parents. So one bad example for me, and they're often things you don't like. So one thing for me is my father was very quick tempered. He was like the ultimate road rage sort of guy. And he'd go from 0 to 100 anger very fast. And, it's kind of scary as a kid to see your father just suddenly lose it and get very angry. And so I said, well, I'm never going to be like that. And then as I get older, I realize I have a tendency that way, for sure. And so what do I do about it then? I just say, right, okay, I'm sort of mindful about it. I just say, oops, I'm starting to feel this anger now. And I don't have to be angry. You don't have to be angry. If you can say, that asshole just cut me off, I'm going to show him. You say, no, wait a minute now. What's the point of that? The guy's going to be an asshole. It's genetic, probably. So what good is it going to be for me to get angry? Because if you're angry, and it's true of my father too, it's not like it just passes in 30 seconds. If I get angry, I'm going to be angry for a while. And what good is that to me? It doesn't do any good. So isn't it better to say, wait a minute now, it's just a labeling. I don't have to be angry. So I can recognize my genetic propensity, and it actually helps me in my life because I know I have that propensity.
Yes. And it makes you more understanding of others, like you said before. When someone did something wrong to you or they shouted to you, you're like, okay, maybe they have some tendencies to be like that, and you're not too judgmental and not too angry with them. So it's really beautiful to and see that.
Well, good. Yep. Well, I hope it
So
helps people to think
I
about genetics.
I have one question, because during the whole time that we're talking, I noticed that you have some innovative thoughts about schooling and how do we teach people and all this stuff. And I am curious to hear your thoughts on school and how school should be, or education in a way.
Yeah. Well, that's a big topic. It's probably the one that I'm most interested in. And it's sort of the same sort of stuff. We need to recognize that children are different in terms of how they learn, and we need to respect those differences to a greater extent. So, one thing I would say is there's no necessary implications for policy. So, if you recognize genetics is important, you can have a right wing point of view philosophy. And you could say, as they do sometimes, educate the best, forget the rest. As a society, put your money into the brightest kids who are going to make the biggest inventions and help society. And then really, don't worry about the rest so much. Just give them a basic education. Now, I think that's pretty dumb because most of the big advances in society, they require intellectual capital in the society. I mean, you can invent something like with computers or whatever, but to make them work in society, you need to have a population that's capable of doing that. So the other point of view, the left-wing view, is called the Finnish model of education, and that is just the opposite. You say, get everybody up to some minimal levels of literacy and numeracy, because if they don't have that, they're not going to be able to participate in society. And then really not forget the rest, but don't worry so much about the rest. And I'm kind of more of that view because the father of behavioral genetics, Francis Galton, said, ability will out. And as we were saying before, if the brightest kids, they'll do pretty well. And especially now with computers and all that's available online, I think, the brightest kids, you almost got to stay out of their way and just, you don't have to give them the training. They'll get it. So I do think that the point I'm making is that there's no necessary policy implications, except at this general level of recognizing and respecting differences. So when kids don't do well at school, you don't just blame the school, blame the parents, blame the kids. It's much more a matter of schools selecting kids. In different areas, kids perform differently. But in England, especially, we have this notorious system at secondary levels where parents spend hundreds of thousands of euros trying to get their kids into the best schools, because the kids in the best schools then go on to the best universities, that sort of thing. But it turns out that the kids in those good schools, select secondary schools, we have these national exams that kids take at the end of compulsory school called GCSE exams. And the kids at the best schools get a whole grade higher. Their average grade is something like a B plus, whereas the average grade of kids in the state schools is like a C plus. Big difference. So people say, yeah, well, that's because they went to better schools. It isn't. We've shown, other people have shown, it's if you select the kids who do the best at school for these secondary schools, they do the best at secondary school. But actually, if you control for what you selected them on, like previous ability and intelligence, there's no difference. So all you've done is select, it's self-fulfilling prophecy. Select the best kids who do well at school. Yeah, and they do well at school, but you didn't add any value to that. And it's hard for parents to understand that, especially when they've spent hundreds of thousands of euros getting their kids into the best schools. Moving house so that you're in a better school district. Do you know? There are cases in England where you can move across the street and pay 20% more for the same house just to get into that better school district. And it doesn't make a difference. So with education, I'm not saying education doesn't matter. Kids have to learn to read and write and do all these other things. And, we can teach them. There's homeschooling. You don't have to have schools to do that. But for most of us who want to go out and work and live our lives, schools are nice. They teach kids basic things, but they don't make a difference. So it doesn't much matter. So again, I would say relax. Kids are going to do pretty well. And in fact, increasingly in England, there's such pressure on these kids, or worst of all, China, with the pressure for doing well on these tests. It's really driving kids to suicide. So I think we've gone too far overboard with this. We ought to relax more and teach. I think, you asked me about education. So I'll say one more thing about it. I do think we've got to teach kids to enjoy learning rather than teaching them to take tests, which is a lot of what we're doing in England, And I have a granddaughter who, was interested in biology, and she asked her biology teacher something. She was just interested in this topic. And he said, well, don't worry about it. It won't be on the test. I think the teacher ought to be taken out back and shot, because if you get a kid who's interested in something, you should encourage that interest. So I think we ought to teach kids to enjoy learning and teach them to learn, because it's said that of the jobs in the future, say 20 years from now, most of them don't exist now. So you can't teach them to do a specific job or anything. You've got to teach them really increasingly now for lifelong learning. It's not like you get out of university, that's the end of it. For most jobs, that's the beginning of it. That's when you're going to learn what you have to do. And to do that, you probably need, I don't know if programming skills anymore with artificial intelligence. I think it'll do the programming for us. But you still need to learn later in life. So I think education ought to make people enjoy learning. And instead, we're turning kids off from learning.
I'm just going to rephrase because this is very, very revolutionizing in my brain. You are saying basically it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things if you send your kid to school or if you put all your effort in 20, 30 years of your life to do homeschooling, or if you do no schooling too much for the kid, like the result will be similar.
Yeah.
And we stress over about the neighborhood that the kids will go for school, about going to the best school, about going in the exams, about the test and all this stuff. And the end of the day, it doesn't matter, which is crazy. Crazy. It's nuts.
Yeah. Well, I would qualify that by saying it has to be good enough education. If you lock a kid in the closet, they're not going to learn to read or write or do mathematics at all. And some schools, probably are so bad that the kids won't do well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The best teacher ever. Good enough
Exactly.
teacher you get by a phone.
I agree. It's going to be more and more that way. And, you might think of things like math training. I mean, how much do kids really need to know math when you can do it on your computer? You don't need to solve equations yourself. I mean, if computers are good at anything, they're good at solving equations. So I think, you need to appreciate the problems and you need to be curious. And I think we beat the curiosity out of kids, even at good schools, by, especially with this testing culture that we have in England, So I agree that we should make it fun, make kids enjoy learning.
In your perspective, how you make kids fall in love with learning? Because school did the opposite in me. Like I made me hate history, made me hate maths, made me hate science. But after that I started myself motivating discovery of the world or something. I am in love with these topics. I cannot emphasize you enough how much beauty I find in them.
Yeah.
So how do you make
Right.
that change?
Right. Well, the first step is to get away from the traditional model of education. A teacher standing in front of a classroom in England, that would be with 30 kids in the classroom, and lecturing. Because what you'll do then is you'll bore half of the kids who, learn very quickly. The other half will feel frustrated because they don't know what you're saying. So we need to personalize education. And with computers, you can definitely do that. What's the point of a teacher lecturing to kids now? The teacher should be used to help kids, say, who have special problems or kids who are specially advanced. You can point them to better online learning programs and that sort of thing. So I think personalizing education is the biggest step, so that you were probably one of the bright kids who got turned off because people are droning on about like in history, teaching kids facts. You've got to memorize these facts because we're going to test you on these facts. That isn't what history is about. History is story, is half of the word of history. These stories are amazing. And, you can't write fiction better than much of the history that you can read about. So you can make kids love history, and they want to read about it in their spare time. But instead, we teach it as a set of facts that a kid has to learn in order to pass a test. That'd turn anybody off. I mean, me too. I was kind of a rebel, and I just didn't like that authoritarian approach. These are the facts you must learn. So I think there's a lot we can do, and especially taking advantage of computers for personalizing education. I mean, like with math, I do not understand how you could teach kids any way other than with one of these computer programs like the Khan program or whatever, which is completely personalized. They see how a kid's doing, progressing on tasks, and they don't let them fail. If they start not doing well, they take it back down to a simpler level. They go back up again. So the kids who aren't doing well, they don't know they're not doing well. They're just progressing more slowly, and they're not failing. And then the kids who do well, you can just go as far and as fast as you want. So I think more and more that's the way it's going to be. And at university, I really do wonder if we're going to have universities. Why do we need universities? We can have the best people in the world give you these lectures. Why are you going to have some,
Which
half-baked?
they are already doing. Like, I
Yeah.
prefer to not go and listen from it. I wanted to do business stuff, but listening a stupid university professor in comparison to Elon Musk teaching business, it sounds like the stupidest thing to do for me.
Yep. And to pay a lot of money. I do think to some extent students like universities because of university life, and fair enough. You know what I mean? Hanging out with all these kids your same age. It's very exciting, and that's something too. But that's another part of education. Education isn't like a factory that produces things, nor is parenting. But with education, we're not trying to produce good little citizens who can do good little jobs, down the line. I think it's partly giving you an opportunity to university. You're not really working at a full-time job. You get a chance to really get exposed to an intellectual environment. You get to learn a lot of stuff, but learn the stuff you want to learn and learn it a lot. But then also, I think the social aspect of it is not nothing. I don't know if it's worth 4 years of your life, and in England, that would be worth 40,000, 50,000 euros. I don't, economically for you, it's probably not worth it. You would have been better off taking that money, investing it or whatever, down payment on a house or something like that. But that isn't what life is about. It isn't just like how you're going to end up with a job or a house or whatever. It's a part of your life. And the same thing with parenting. It's a big part of your life. It isn't like a factory where you're producing good little citizens, So you should enjoy that bit of your life, and university as well. It's not just education or instruction. The instruction is the idea of you're sticking it in people's heads. Instruction. It's education. You're kind of leading it out. And part of that is social. You want to hang around with other people who have interests like you, and they stimulate you, you know? So I think that's a bigger part of it than people realize. And like I was wondering after COVID, where I had a cohort of students who never went to university because they couldn't, you know? They couldn't, the university was shut down. And I thought we all went online with teaching. You actually got a lot more personalized education online because you don't have to like set up an appointment to see me in my office. You know, you just say, like to chat, you just chat online, you know, it's all done. So I think there were a lot of advantages to it. I was kind of surprised though, when the pandemic, you know, when lockdown was over, the students definitely wanted to come back to in-person tests. They said the question was in-person teaching, online or hybrid. Well, the students, they wanted in-person teaching. I have a feeling that they didn't want in-person teaching. They wanted in-person university. They wanted to be at a university, I think, to be with all the other students. I don't think it was really that they wanted their lectures in person. Because actually, when you then teach these classes that they said they wanted in person, if you give them a hybrid opportunity, 80% of the class will not be there. Because online, they can stop it when they want to. They can go back to it. They can play it over and over again. Whereas you hear a lecture, you know, you forget most of it anyway. And so I think there is something to in-person teaching, but if you're going to lecture to a class, as I do, sometimes 500 students, I mean, why shouldn't I just be on film? I mean, you know, what's the difference? You know, looking out at 500 students. So I wonder, you know, if universities are really needed. The thing I've come to realize, though, that they're not just for education and instruction at this input level of cognition, because you can do that a lot better online, like you say, with your phone. But it's more of a university life. And then I don't dismiss that. You know, I think that maybe is a cool bit of people's lives. You know, when they look back on it, I know a lot of middle-aged people would say, that was really a great time of life. You know, that was kind of my favorite time of life. So I could
it's
go
a
on and on
business
about
opportunity for it's a business opportunity for people to create a university that is no teaching but just gathering of students of people to have fun, go party.
But to meet people, I think it does change people's lives too, you know, in terms of getting to know people who down the line, you know, now that it isn't, it's such a different world of adulthood now. It isn't like it when I was growing up. It's like that Bruce Springsteen song, you know, at 16 and got out of high school, got married, had a kid, got a job. That's all she wrote, you know, something like that. That's the way it used to be. You get a job for life, you know, on the factory line or something like that. Whereas now there are no jobs for life. Everything's freelance and, you know, people have lots of different jobs, you know, and I think that could be really good. And, you know, you could maybe find what you like to do to a greater extent than just working in a factory where you hate what you do and you just live for the weekends, you know? So I think it can be really exciting. And maybe university would help increasingly to get people moving in that direction.
So I was right that I sense that you have big passion for education. And the right education, and you have a
but I
lot
don't
of
have any
ideas on the
influence,
topic.
unfortunately. I wish I had more influence on it. I kind of give up. It's really very backward, you know, in education. It's the one area of the social sciences that still hasn't really come around to genetics, which is a big mistake because all the things we teach, cognitive abilities, are the most heritable traits. And yet, you know, you look at what teachers, you know, teacher training courses, you look at their books, that sort of thing, nothing on genetics. Whereas I think genetics is the most important thing that parents need to know about kids and teachers need to know about students. And that's another
And
pet peeve
that's,
of
you
mine.
think, one of the reasons that you are doing all this podcast and stuff.
Exactly right. Yeah. I've given up on teachers. I think teachers recognize genetic influence, but at the higher levels, the policymakers and stuff, you just can't get them to realize that they have to come to terms with these DNA scores. Parents are going to be coming to them saying, look, my kid has a high risk of being reading disabled. What are we going to do about it? Let's not wait until they're at second or third grade and then fail at reading. Let's do something beforehand. Because if you wait till kids fail on reading tests, then there's a lot of collateral damage. I mean, they're kind of branded as stupid, and you can fix reading problems. You can help kids to read, even though they'll find it more difficult than other kids. They need to learn in different ways. Kids who are good at reading, one of my sons, I had this wife. I've been married several times, and she had this kid, and this was in the 70s, and she was someone who felt like we shouldn't teach kids stuff. So she was determined, even though she was a head of a daycare center for kids, she was determined that her kid wasn't going to learn to read. She thought it was bad that parents were pushing their kids to read early, So she actually went out of her way not to have her kid read. Well, that kid learned to read in about 2 weeks, was just learning to read newspapers. Once got the hang of it, once other people started interfering with the mother's plans, this kid was just reading, It didn't need special phonics or special training, but I think kids who have trouble learning to read, they need more help, and you can help them. There are definitely good programs for helping kids to learn to read. But again, it's personalized. Some kids can't learn to read because they really do have dyslexia. They have visual problems, so that makes it harder for them to learn to read. Well, you don't want to give that kid the same training program you'd give other kids who really have trouble with comprehension. So, yep. So there's a lot we can do here.
I have one question that I ask every guest. If I give you $1 trillion, how do you spend it for maximum impact in the world?
Was that 1 trillion or 1 billion or 1 million? What did you say?
Trillion.
Trillion. Great. Okay.
Trillion.
Well, what I would do is, I'm very concerned about inequalities, and I think in all advanced countries that's really going to be a major problem. It's partly what I think is causing the divisions especially like you see in America, between the haves and have-nots. So from a genetic point of view, I'm going to do this from a genetic point of view rather than a straight political, philosophical point of view. If you take the kids from the most socially disadvantaged environments, like kids who are on welfare and who don't have enough to eat, we can do this in England, that there are kids who qualify for free school meals, for example. They're well below the poverty line for income. If you take DNA from those kids, you'll find that some of those kids have very high genetic scores for learning ability. Even though their parents weren't educated, as I said, kids are 50% like their parent, but that means they're 50% not like their parents. So if you take a population of kids from the worst environments, you'll find a big distribution of their genetic scores. And I think we're wasting that intellectual capital, because in that environment, they're going to get ground down. And very soon, they're not going to do well at school, even though they have the genetic potential. So what I would like to do is to test kids genetically, beginning with the most socially disadvantaged environments, and to give those kids a leg up, to just give them opportunities to develop. And that's good for society too, because those kids are going to be as bright as any kids in the population. So that's how I would like to start. But what I would like to do with $1 trillion, I could do it easily, is get DNA for all kids. But that's going to happen anyway. Eventually all kids. In England, they're now piloting it for 100 million euros. is to get DNA testing on newborns from a medical point of view, because you want to intervene early for these medical sorts of problems. And so you can get the DNA at birth. And once you get DNA once, you can do all of these things I'm talking about, in terms of testing. So you could then predict about their obesity, their cardiovascular risk, alcoholism, how well they'll do at school, whether they have reading problems or not, from that one bit of DNA. So I would begin to personalize education. And I'm working with a company called GEMS Education, who's responsible for teaching 40% of all the kids in the United Arab Emirates. And it's a charitable organization by this billionaire guy who he thinks the best thing you can do for society is educate kids properly. And so he's very keen on this idea of personalization. And because he controls this, he can make decisions that's so hard to make within educational systems. They're so bogged down in bureaucracy, and to make any change is very difficult. I kind of give up. I don't have enough energy and time in life, to do it. But it'd be kind of neat to work. I'm looking forward to working with the GEMS Education for that reason. And if you had $1 trillion, you could do it yourself, probably. You could just begin to do this. And I think it'll happen, though, because once, say, with ADHD, hyperactivity, attention deficit disorder, 10% of kids now are getting diagnosed as ADHD. And in the US especially, the main treatment is drugs. They give those kids amphetamines. That's it's called Ritalin, but it's basically an amphetamine. Well, if you could show, and this is going to happen fairly soon, I think, that some kids with ADHD will respond very well to Ritalin, but other kids, it'll be bad for them, just like it's bad for you and me to take too much amphetamine. When I was at university, that's what kids did. It's no magic that you give hyperactive kids without much attention span, you give them amphetamines, because back in the 60s, that's what you did. You study for a college exam, you take speed because it makes you focused, but you take it too much and you start getting paranoid, and it really does mess you up. So if we could find a genetic predictor of whether your kid will respond to amphetamines or not, every parent's going to want it. You don't want to give your kid drugs if it's actually going to be bad for them. So that's the way this is going to happen. And I think it'll really happen first on the medical side. We're going to realize that for preventive medicine, you need the DNA prediction. Once you get it for that, you can use it for anything. And then, so I think it's starting to happen. There are some countries like Finland and Estonia where if you go into the hospital and they take blood, they ask if you want your DNA tested. And 85% of the people say yes. Why not? They'll tell you if you have a risk for heart attacks, for example. And whether they make the DNA available to you is another issue. But 30 million people have paid to have their DNA tested by these companies like 23andMe. So, 30 million people paying it's about 150 euros to have that done. So people are doing it themselves. So I think it's only a matter of time until everybody has their DNA. I mean, it just takes a tiny memory stick. You don't need much memory on it. You got 3 billion base pairs of DNA. That's it. That's all you need, is the digital information on 3 billion base pairs. And that's you genetically. And from that, then we can do everything else I'm talking
why
about.
Why not 8 billion?
Why not 8 billion? Because we have 23 chromosomes and there's 3 billion base pairs of DNA on each chromosome. So you could say 6. Is that what you're saying, 6? Because you get one chromosome from your mother, one from your father. So although there are 3 billion base pairs of DNA, you actually have double that. You have one chromosome from your mother, one from your father. But what we're talking about here is at each step in the spiral staircase of DNA, each chromosome, you can have one of two alleles. So you can be like, there's four, it's a 4-letter alphabet, A, C, T's, and G's. And at any base pair, any spiral step, any step in the spiral staircase of DNA, you could have an AT or a TC or a TG or a TT. That TT, that double amino acid it's called, that is what we mean by your genotype at that locus on the chromosome. But anyway, 3 billion, or if you think about both your mother's and your father's chromosome, 6 billion. But still, it's a trivial amount of information these days, and a memory stick can easily handle that. The other bit of it is that for 99% of all those 3 billion base pairs of DNA, there are no real differences between us. All humans have basically the same gene, the same spiral staircase, the step in the spiral staircase. And so you could only really need to know about the 1% that differs, because that's what we're talking about, the DNA differences that make us different. But the hot thing now is you sequence all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. And that's what you'd want, because sometimes, even though 99.999% of all of us have the same genes at this one locus, it's important sometimes to know that you have one of those rare mutations, like 1 in a million or something like that. So why not? So if you get all the sequence of DNA, all 3 billion base pairs, that's it. That's all you inherit. That's all that's genetic. It doesn't change from the moment of conception. So genetically, that's the end of the story. That's all we need to know. So even though you don't really need to have all 3 billion base pairs, that's what's going to happen. It's happening now. There are companies that will do that for you.
This is a big topic, but I want you to touch briefly. All this stuff will change, your work will change everything by artificial intelligence now?
By artificial intelligence, did you say?
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. That isn't my area of expertise, but
it will. Do you think it will influence a lot your area of this stuff that you're doing?
Sure, it's going to change everything. Writing, analysis. Like if we do, scripts for analysis, you can ask ChatGPT-4, to do that for you, or what it can do really well, because algorithms, man, that's what computers are all about. So that's what AI is about, is algorithms, basically. So yeah, it can do that. But, I've just messed around with it a bit, like you write an abstract for a paper and you say, sometimes you have to write a lay summary, a summary that's less in scientific language and more in the public language. And I've just said, write me a lay version of this abstract. And it's amazing. It blew me away. It's not just like in computerese, it's literary. It really is every bit as good as I could do. And that kind of fascinates me, because we always thought that robots and artificial intelligence was going to wipe out lower level jobs, like routine, boring jobs. But now this level of artificial intelligence, it's going to attack, substitute, or you could say optimize these higher level jobs, using them as co-pilots people talk about. But I just think it's tremendously exciting. I know people are worried about the risks. Sam Harris worries about existential risks, that they're going to decide, AI is going to decide they don't need us and write us out of the picture. I don't know. But like you, well, I'm an optimist too. And I just think it's really exciting. And I think it's going to change a lot of what we do. And if you think about 3 billion base pairs of DNA, certainly artificial intelligence can pick out patterns of genetic effects that we could never, ever do ourselves. These higher order interactions. It's very good. It's like face recognition. If you say, here's people with this particular weird disease, and here's their 3 billion base pairs of DNA. Maybe it isn't just one. Maybe you're picking up a combination of 2 rare mutations that only happens 1 in 10,000 times. But you got these 3 people who have the disorder, and here's a training set of 10,000 other people. it's just like face recognition. You just say, distinguish these faces. And, just the sort of thing that AI is really, really good at. So yeah, I'm very excited about it. It's not nothing specific to genetics that I know I can think of, but it's going to affect everything in science, everything that we do, from planning papers, like, what do we know about this area? Well, you could spend, when I was in graduate school, we didn't have computers, and we had to go to the library, and you ask for this article, and then you find the next article. You spend a day and maybe you've looked at a dozen articles. Now it's just seconds. And now with AI, you don't even have to do that. You just ask Chat GPT, what do we know about inflammation as it affects schizophrenia? Or how about in people who are both schizophrenic and depressed? It's just amazing how it comes up with stuff. Increasingly, though, people are pointing out it also hallucinates. It really does make things up when it doesn't know something. So you got to be a little careful with that. But I just find it totally amazing. I mean, do you agree? Are you worried about it?
uh, I'm taking one step further that debate, and I'm if I'm worried about, and I think that even we don't need to worry at all, because even if they kill us, the robots kill us, maybe it's for the greater good of evolution. Maybe we don't. Maybe maybe we don't know what we are going to miss if they kill us. Maybe they kill us and then they go and discover other worlds and other planets with people inside. So I don't know. It's a bit crazy what I'm saying, but
well, carbon-based life isn't the only form of life, right? You could have a silicon-based life. Like in terms of sending men to Mars, which is Elon Musk's thing. Why are we sending people? Because it's going to be a one-way trip, no matter what they say. You're not going to be able to assemble the resources on Mars to send people back. But why would you even want to send people there? I mean, it's such a horrible environment. Why not do it in silicon? You could send artificial intelligence there, and maybe it can reproduce, and maybe it will end up, just being so much more advanced than us. Probably it wouldn't care about us, but if it did, it wipes us out. But as you're saying, that's evolution. They can evolve, and silicon can reproduce, without the constraints of biological carbon-based reproduction.
Yes, and it kind of teleport. It can do so many things that but it's a very interesting time that you are living. I think I'm really a bit more luckier than you, because I'm 23 and I'm going to see a lot of these things.
Yeah, I'm envious.
Talking probably.
Exactly right. Things are going faster and faster, aren't they? It's hard to imagine what's going to happen next, because I just heard a podcast with Frank Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History. Well, can you imagine someone who wrote, okay, it's all over now. History has ended. He was talking about the political atmosphere, but even at that level, of course, things have changed totally since he wrote that. So I'm just very envious that you're going to have another 75 years, I hope, to take advantage of these advances, and maybe things will change so much. Maybe you've got a couple hundred years, I mean, it's not impossible. Maybe we turn you into silicon, but if it's just exactly as you, it has every thought, everything that you have in your brain, and it's thinking like you, and it could even have an emotion. It's you. I mean, it's like your clone, and okay, we get rid of your body, but you're still there at some level. I mean, it's not impossible that we can change to silicon rather than carbon.
And it's funny, because this is a bit crazy scenario, but maybe you die and we don't. We never die, and you are the last person that died. It would be a bit unfortunate if nobody dies and you guys are the last generation of people that is dying.
Yeah, but I wouldn't mind that terribly because okay, I am going to die, but I've had a good life, and that's part of this mindfulness stuff too, and stoicism, thinking, yeah, I've had a good innings, and all we've really got is what we've got now anyway, so you've got to really be in the moment and enjoy it, and then, not worry. I find as people get older, my parents died at 97 a couple of years ago, and they were living in an old people's home. But I was quite amazed. Nobody there is freaked out about death. They don't want to die a horrible death, but they're not worried. They laugh, they joke about it. So and so kicked the bucket the other day. They're just kind of reconciled, accepting of death. And we all should be. We shouldn't wait until we get old. We should realize, life is finite, and you've got to live for the moment and experience life to the full. Not to just think, oh, if only I get that job or that girl or that house or that car, then I'll be happy. You got to live in this moment and love it. And to the point where you're saying, well, if I died now, it's okay. I've had a good innings. I'm happy. Not just to get to that when you get old.
What do you want to leave behind in this world?
What do I want to leave behind? Are you saying? Is that what you said? Well, I'm pleased with what I've left behind, but I'm not, it doesn't matter. In the long run, if anybody's doing something because they think they're changing the world, they should probably spend more time thinking about what they're doing and how they're enjoying life on a day-to-day moment, because none of it really makes a difference in the long run. I mean, I think I've done some things, that are pretty revolutionary, and they'll probably have an effect, I hope they do, to the good, making parents relax and maybe changing the education system. But I don't fool myself into thinking that's what made my life worthwhile. I've just had fun. I like doing what I'm doing, and I enjoy it on a day-to-day basis. I still have good students, good ideas. It's exciting and fun. And, that for me is really what it's about. And I don't, it's nice if you feel you've left the world a better place, for sure. But we delude ourselves if we think, we're going to have such a big effect on people, because, we're not that special, and other people will, anything we would have done, anything I've done, other people would have done it eventually. I think we would have gotten to this point anyway. So, it's not to be modest. It's just to say, in a way, it sounds bad, doesn't it, to say, it's great that I've done some things that I hope will help society, but really what motivates me on a day-to-day basis is I just like doing what I'm doing. I like having these scientific problems and trying to solve them and working with bright people, So it's another way of saying having fun.
I love you. Thank you for your time. And I'm so grateful that you took this time. And
yeah, it was great talking to you.
This was one of the most beautiful hours, 2 hours of my life.
Huh. Well, very nice of you to say so. I hope your listeners like it too, but who cares? You and I had a good time.
Thank you for watching, guys. Bye-bye. We love you.
Ciao. Bye-bye.